Hey, welcome back. So now that we understand the landscape of Microsoft Excel's business intelligence tools, let's jump right into Power Query, the foundation of Microsoft Excel's BI stack. So what is Power Query? In short, it's a powerful ETL tool. Now ETL stands for Extract, Transform, and Load, which is what Power Query can do with external data sources in Excel. And while Power Query used to be an add-in before Excel 2016, it's now built right into Excel. It's just another feature you can access from the ribbon like anything else. So we've established that Power Query is an ETL tool, but what does that really mean? What does it really do? So the first step of ETL is extraction. That means Power Query can extract data from a wide range of sources. We're talking text files, comma-separated value files, databases of many kinds, and even other spreadsheets, just to name a few. But extracting the data is just the beginning. Next, Power Query gives us the ability to apply all sorts of transformations to that data, just about anything you can imagine. The point here is to take the kind of messy, raw data that commonly exists in the real world and transform it, prettify it, so to speak, so it meets our particular needs. And then finally, Power Query gives us the ability to load that transformed data into Excel. So now that we know what Power Query is and what it does, how can we get to it? Well, as I've mentioned, Power Query is now a built-in feature in Excel. So we access it through the ribbon just like conditional formatting or pivot tables or any other Excel feature. So first we'll go to our Data tab on the ribbon. And then if we look at all the commands over on the left side of the tab, in the Get and Transform Data section, pretty much any of these will ultimately lead us to Power Query. They're basically just user-friendly shortcuts that will tee up certain configurations of the Power Query editor window for us. So we've talked about extracting, transforming, and loading data, and obviously extracting data is the first step in that process. So that's what we'll tackle first. As our example, we'll use a CSV or comma-separated value file that contains information about real estate sales by a fictional real estate agency. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the comma-separated values format, it's a very, very common format in which raw data is stored in the real world. So to extract that data into Excel from Power Query, we'll click this Get Data button, and now we see a variety of categories of sources from which we can extract data. Files, databases, and then Azure, which is Microsoft's suite of cloud services. Now a CSV file is just that, it's a file, so we'll hover over From File, and now we see a variety of file types that we have the option of extracting data from. Now the first one listed here is actually From Workbook, which means just another Excel workbook. For our purposes though, we're pulling from a text or CSV file, so I'll select that option. And now Excel brings up a File Explorer dialog box, and all I have to do at this point is just navigate through my file system until I find the file that I'm trying to import. So here's that file. So we'll click that file to select it, and then just choose Import. Now after waiting just a moment for the data to load, we see that Excel gives us a preview of the data that we will be fetching from that CSV file. Now it's not showing us the entire file here or all the data. It's just going to show us all the columns and then a sample of the first few rows of that data. Of particular importance when you're importing a text file is your choice of delimiter, which is how the columns of data in text files are separated from one another. So since we're dealing with a CSV or comma-separated values file, Excel correctly guesses that we want to use a comma as our delimiter. But of course we have the option to choose a variety of other delimiters. But we're going to stick with comma. And overall our data looks good. It looks like what I would expect. So now to load this data set into Excel, I will unsurprisingly click the Load button. Now before I do that, take note of this Transform Data button. This is the button we click if we're not satisfied with every single aspect of this data as is, and we want to apply some transformations to it before we pull it into Excel. We're going to get into that a little bit later. So for now, I'll just click Load. And then after waiting just a moment, you see that our text file data has been successfully imported into a brand new worksheet in our Excel workbook as a table. Now, if you're not familiar with Excel tables, they're a special structure in Excel that's specifically designed to make working with structured data, the kind of data that comes out of databases, for example, easy and convenient. And they have lots of features that make working with that type of data a more streamlined process. Also note that by default, Excel based the name of our new worksheet after the name of the file that we imported. But obviously that's something we could change if we wanted to. So now that we've imported a simple text file, I also want to demonstrate how to import a type of data that if you work in the world of business intelligence, you just can't avoid. And that's data from a database. Databases, especially relational databases like, for example, Microsoft SQL Server, are absolutely ubiquitous in the world of business intelligence. Chances are, if you're working in a business intelligence, analytics, or data science type role, you're going to encounter data in a relational database at some point and have to work with that data. So next I want to show you how you can pull data directly from a SQL Server table right into Excel using Power Query. So we'll follow the same steps as before. We'll go to our Data tab on the ribbon, and then Get Data. But now instead of getting the data from a file, we'll get it from a database, and we'll choose from SQL Server Database. Now here we're prompted to enter the name of our database server, and this is something you would have to know in order to connect to your particular database. So I'll just paste that in. And then optionally, I can also specify the name of the database I'm interested in, and I do know that. That's AdventureWorks 2019. And then I'll just click OK. And right away, we get a preview of all the objects in that database that are available for us to fetch into Excel. So let's say, just for example, I want to pull in this person.person table. All I have to do is click it to select it, and then just take a quick preview of the data to see if it looks like what I expect. And then lastly, just click Load, exactly like we did before. And after closing our Queries and Connections pane once again, we can scroll across to check out the different columns of data that we pulled in. And it looks like all of our data was imported successfully. And the great thing about these external data connections that we're establishing is that they're refreshable. So if this table changes periodically, we can always fetch the latest and greatest data just by clicking anywhere inside this table and then clicking the Refresh button right here on our Table Design tab. Now before we go, I want to take this concept of fetching data from a relational database with Power Query to the next level by not just pulling in an entire table, but actually issuing a SQL statement directly to the database via Power Query. Now don't worry if you are not familiar with SQL or not terribly comfortable with SQL. You won't need to understand the syntax you're about to see to appreciate how the process works in Power Query. The bottom line is, it's basically a language we use to interact with databases and fetch subsets of data from those databases according to criteria that we specify. So let's say, for example here, that I didn't want to pull in all the people in this person.person table, but instead I only wanted to pull in people with the initials TLC. That is to say, the first letter of their first name is T, the first letter of their middle name is L, and the first letter of their last name is C. So to do that, first we'll go again back to our Data tab, and then hit our Get Data button once more, and again from Database and from SQL Server. And we'll use the same server and the same database. But now instead of clicking OK, we'll click Advanced Options here. Now these advanced options include issuing a custom SQL statement to the database. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So I've already written a SQL statement that pulls in people with those TLC initials in advance. So I'm just going to paste that right in here. And now I can click OK. And once again, Power Query is showing me a preview of the data that will be returned. But instead of the 19,000 plus rows that were in that person table, we only see 5 rows. And if we look at the first, middle, and last names of the people in these rows, it looks like their initials are all TLC. So I think our query worked. So now I'll click Load. And there we have it. SQL code embedded right into an Excel report that pulls in custom views of data from our database right into Excel. Now, as we'll see in the coming videos, Power Query has a ton of functionality for transforming the data we're pulling from external sources. But when it comes to transforming data from relational databases, the SQL language is still the undisputed king. So if you know SQL and your data is from an external database, consider this option to embed SQL queries directly into your Power Query connection. Okay, so speaking of those transformations, up next we'll dig into some of the many ways you can transform the data you've imported with Power Query. I'll see you then.